The computer is working for now, so we're going to go. I am Teresa Jacobs. I'm with Willamette Partnership. If you were here at the first public meeting, we have already met. My colleague Kellen Baez and I work on this project together along with some other folks. Unfortunately, Kellen is sick today, so she is not able to join us, but we still have backup online in Barton Robison, if you want to wave, Barton. Why don't we do, I know we're getting started a few minutes late, but I still think it would be really helpful to do a quick round of introductions and then we'll get in the meeting. So the way we're going to do this, name, organization, what you're hoping to get out of today as quickly as possible. We're going to go around the room, but we're going to have everybody in chat just type it into the chat. So again, it's name, organization, and what you hope to get out of today. And I will do mine, we'll have Barton do his, and then we'll come back to the room. So again, I'm Teresa Jacobs. I'm a facilitator with Willamette Partnership. And today, my hope is that we really dig in on the webinar findings that you probably have seen, or if you haven't, you'll learn about them today, and start to find paths forward. That's my hope. Barton, do you want to go?
Morning, everybody. My name is Barton Robison. I am the Interim Executive Director here at Willamette Partnership, and I am excited to get some good, solid feedback that can help inform this next public meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Barton. So if everybody online can drop into the chat, name, organization, hope for the day, we'll go quickly around the room, starting here.
Sean Miller, I represent the Coastal Conservation Association. I was hoping to get out of today just a clear understanding of moving forward in the small group settings and coming up with a good resolution for our hatcheries moving forward.
Okay, can people hear online? Maybe we need to pass around a microphone. Pass around, okay. I'm going to attempt to turn this on. Let's see what happens. Is there a button? There are hidden buttons.
Yeah, so you'll have to turn your mic off if this one's going to be on.
Okay.
Sean Miller with the Coastal Conservation Association, and so.
Are we talking to them or these guys?
Can you all hear this mic online? Yep.
So I'm director at Exist. Hi. And also the CCA Oregon's Director of Communications. I just am very interested in this process and encouraged by what we're seeing.
Good morning. My name is Larry Phillips, and I cover fisheries policy issues on the West Coast for the American Sport Fishing Association. I hope to help better understand the need and the process to advance the Oregon hatcheries into the future based on science, based on social and economics. So, thank you.
Here is CCA. I hope to get the hatchery, the hatchery spawning and run timing issues brought up, and hope they will show that it's not just temperature problems, that it's these fish can't adjust to where we've put them in the hatchery and the spawn and run timing.
Steve Cortain, CCA, with Gary.
Skip Baum with the Florence Step Group, but I'm interested in getting Chinook. Local people are kicked off the river after we catch 2 fish, while the guides can make 2 trips a day with 5 new people each time. And the Fishermen's Association had given our step group some money to try to raise Chinook in that system. And Evidently, ODFW's management has run us down from 5 fish. Now we're down to 2 fish for the whole season. Why should I spend $46 to buy 2 fish?
Bill Hennig, I'm with the Florence Step Group. We're looking to see the way forward with solving all these problems.
Dennis Dinsmore, Florence Step Group President, just wanting to make sure the hatchery program goes forward, because otherwise the steelhead eggs that we harvest and send to hatcheries may not be processed so we can raise steelhead to get back in our rivers and lakes.
Seth White, and also to see if there's any opportunities how research can support the findings from this group going forward.
I'm Ashley Sanders. I'm a research assistant with Seth at OSU, and I'm just interested in seeing how the data get translated into policy decisions.
My name is Carl Finley. I'm not representing an organization, but I'm a former salmon troller who has a long-term interest in hatchery costs.
I'm Bruce Harple. I'm with the Oregon Fishing Club, and what I'd like to do today is introduce a couple of ideas regarding new hatchery practices based on science that's been done in Maine and other areas of the world.
We have lost audio online, just a heads up. I think we lost it again. We're not hearing anything.
And at the Oregon Hatchery Research Center, I was
She was Attorney General when she was senator.
so then years there. Now I be able to get out and catch a fish now and then.
All right, we'll give this a try. I'm Jennifer Fairbrother. I'm with Native Fish Society, and I'm looking forward to today and the small group process to see if there are opportunities for alignment to move forward on this issue.
Hi, I'm Dave Moskowitz with Conservation Angler, and we're really pleased to be here to work through, kind of try to find a way to thread the needle between wild fish and hatchery fish so that our kids have some of the same opportunities we have now. And I'm really pleased with ODFW's embracing this challenge to look at this important state infrastructure and figure out what's the blueprint going forward.
Tom Vanderplaat. I am a member of the Restoration Enhancement Board and also an active angler, and help run the program for the Fish Eggs to Fry program for the Northwest Steelheaders in the Washington County area. And so I'm just interested in helping out with this process, understanding that hatcheries are an important part of small communities and the economy for those folks. In fact, I caught a hatchery fish yesterday. So nice, about an 18-pound fall Chinook. So.
My name is Sherry Beals. I work here in fish propagation, and I'm just here to observe.
Good morning. My name's Scott Patterson. I'm the Fish Propagation Manager for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm here just to get the feedback from a very bunch of group of people that have different opinions.
Good morning. My name is Colby Gonzalez. I work for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians. I'm the Fish Program Manager. I'm here to learn about the fish hatchery assessment that was done and hopefully leave here learning maybe a path moving forward and how we can all work together to have fish out there for people to harvest and see and all of the above.
Cheers. I might just round it out for ODFW here. So we got Michelle Dennehy in the back there, who's with our Information Education Department. Chris Lorian, who's been helping Scott and I really kind of lead this process. And then Linda Spancel, who's been helping us set up the logistics for these meetings. And I'm Sean Clements, and I've been the figurehead, I guess, for this initiative, where we're really trying to chart a path forward that's sustainable for our hatchery system and delivers for everyone in the state. Turn it back to Teresa, who's really been helping us.
The microphone is cutting out again, Teresa.
Now?
Sort of.
Sort of. Can you hear?
Yes, much better.
Okay. I think the issue, and we are going to try to work with this, is the two microphones can't be on at the same time. So there's a little transition period. My question was, any sort of learnings as you scroll through the chat about why people are here, if you want to give just a quick summary, Barton, so we hear from the group online?
Yeah, and folks, if you've not yet shared an introduction and something you're looking forward to today, please do in the chat. We've got lots of people who are looking to listen and learn. A lot of people who are very curious about the process and what will be moving forward. And we've got some interest in reviews of the data and science, optimism around people realizing the value of Oregon's hatcheries. Yeah, pretty good, diverse set of interests online.
Great, thank you. So let's dive in. Thanks for doing that. I think if we're going to work together, it's nice to spend a little bit of time sort of hearing each other and hearing perspectives, which we have the benefit of doing. ODF, Sean has the benefit of doing, but you don't necessarily get to hear each other all the time. So I thought that would be a helpful start. So here's what we're here to do today. We have 3 meeting objectives, which we'll introduce in a minute. We are going to do a quick process review, because I know people are interested in what is the entirety of this process and where are we in the process. Sean's going to give us a contractor update. We're going to go through the key takeaways from the webinars that occurred earlier this month and really, hopefully, with your help, start to digest those together, listen to people's questions and concerns, any clarifications that are needed so you can really understand the data and work with it as you're working with each other. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the department's concept of an infrastructure blueprint, which is what we're here to inform. So let's sort of put our thoughts together about what we can create that will be helpful to the department. So I want to hear a little conversation back and forth between the department and you all, so we make sure that the effort is targeted to be effective. And then we're going to talk about the small group structure and the department's sort of interest in working with a small group and set up some understandings between this larger group online and in the room and the smaller group representatives, so we can make sure there's a good flow of information back and forth. The small group process is intended to be efficient because we have a short period of time, but inclusive as well. So we want to make sure we set up a good system so anybody who's not participating in the small group knows who to contact to get their ideas shared, who to contact if they have questions about what the small group is doing. So that's what we're here to do today. Any questions before we move forward? Online, in the room? Okay. Just sort of mechanics. Barton, and we'll have somebody else this afternoon, is the facilitator for the folks online. So if you're having any trouble, you can't hear, you don't understand something, you can use the chat to sort of alert Barton, and he has carte blanche to interrupt me anytime he needs to tell us that folks can't hear or whatever else we need to hear. So that's how we're working together. We are going to have a lunch break at noon. I hope you'll use that time to obviously feed yourself, but sort of chat with each other, get to know each other. I'm going to hopefully sit with you and get to chat with you all a little bit more. And then for the online folks, you'll have a little bit of free time. We'll give you a time to come back after you eat, you know, take a walk, whatever you'd like to do, and we'll get started. All right. Let's, I think folks know this, but just in case you don't, Willamette Partnership's role here is to help with the public process. And we really envision this as kind of a three-legged stool where there is the department is sort of the seat, and they're holding together one leg, which is tribal consultation, one leg, which is the data and the work with contractors they've been doing to sort of inform this process. And then the other leg is the public process. That's what we're doing right now. And together, the information from the tribes, the information from the contractors, and the information that you all put together for the department will help to inform the process and help to inform their thinking on where they want to invest and where they may not want to invest in the future. So here are our objectives for the day. It's 3 parts, and the meeting will be in 3 parts. We want to understand and discuss the implications of the analyses that were presented in the webinar series and start exploring potential routes forward. That's this morning. That's what we're going to talk about. And Sean's going to give an update. I understand the reports are not available yet. He'll let us know when they will be available. So we're working with the data that has been presented and that is available today. And we will bring additional data and reports forward when they're ready. So that's this morning.
Teresa, I just want to flag, we might have some other folks in the waiting room waiting to be admitted still.
Okay.
For our ODFW friends who are facilitating online, could you make sure to check that every few minutes? Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Barton. This afternoon, we're going to talk about and create a little bit of alignment between each other and ODFW on the infrastructure blueprint work product and what the small working group is actually developing to give to the department. And then we're going to talk about the small working group process and how to keep the small working group and this larger group linked up so that you have a voice throughout the process. That's what we're here for today. Any questions about those objectives online or in the room? Great. Let's see. I'm going to let the department sort of go through. Many of you have seen these slides, but Sean, if you don't mind, I'll have you go through them again to talk about kind of where we're headed with this process, what the department is looking for. I don't know. There we go.
Oh, cheers. Okay, hey everyone. We've been through this slide a few times during the webinars and in the June meeting, but just kind of a reminder that the department really started looking at this issue of the kind of sustainability of a hatchery system following 2020 fires, Labor Day fires, where we lost Rock Creek Hatchery, lost Klamath Hatch House, and several of our facilities in the Willamette were also impacted. And it was just kind of a moment in time where you realized how vulnerable the system was, particularly when you lose one or two facilities. It puts a lot more strain on the rest of the system. But building up to that time period, really, we've been seeing challenges at several facilities, Rock Creek being one of them, LC being another, for example, Sandy, where temperatures are just increasing in the rivers, flows are decreasing, and we're struggling in some places to make a quality product. So the intent from the department was really to take a look and identify the vulnerabilities of our system and then plot a path forward. And that really kicked into high gear last year when the legislature allocated $1 million for this review. And it really gave us the opportunity to work with some contractors to create some additional capacity, do some of these analyses that you've all seen in the last few weeks on these webinars, looking at the economics of the system, the benefits it's providing to Oregonians, looking at the climate vulnerability, so assessing each hatchery and how's it doing for flows, temperatures, disease, etc. And then also looking at the current state of the system. We know a lot of these facilities were built in the 1920s through 70s. They've been somewhat upgraded over time, but there's still a large deferred maintenance bill, and that's some of the things that these contractors assessed. And for example, on the Columbia Basin, a couple of years ago, we assessed the need in the basin, which is all the states and tribes, and it was over $1 billion in deferred maintenance, so pretty hefty bill. The federal government has been coming to the table recently, particularly with the initiative from the 6 sovereigns. There was $240 million allocated for deferred maintenance at Columbia and tribal hatcheries. There's also potentially money coming through the USV Oregon Lower Snake Comp, a couple of $100 million there for deferred maintenance. So they are starting to pick these things off, but on the state side, there really isn't that funding stream yet, and there also isn't like a plan, which is what this is intended to do, is develop a plan that we can then go to the legislature and ask for these investments in the system. So we've been sharing the information that they've been collecting over time in the last few webinars, and that's part of what we're going to discuss today. Thanks. Or is it this one?
No, it's this one. Is this what you want to have?
Yeah. So the focus of this group really is going to be, and the small group, is really going to be the state hatchery system. So recognizing we operate 33 facilities, a number of those are federal, primarily in Columbia Basin, Willamette, and then down in the Rogue. The 14 state hatcheries are the ones where we have control over kind of what we're doing there, and control over the investments we can make and the things we can do. And that's really the focus here, is like, for the state, putting in place a system that's sustainable for us to operate and meets the needs of everyone that relies on that system. We did include 3 federal facilities in this review, South Sanium, Leeburg, and Coal Rivers. And we included those because Coal Rivers is really integral to the whole Southwest system, and it has additional capacity. The state's already rearing fish there for multiple programs, and the federal government is investing a lot in that facility to get it back up to speed after several kind of challenges of the last decade. Leeburg, likewise, the federal government actually has in the works a plan to turn that over to the state, but given the challenges with Leeburg in terms of Leeburg Dam, the state has said that we really want to get that in a place where we can take it over and be successful. We don't want to take over an investment that's going to be stranded when that dam comes out. So, but it has a lot of cool, clean water, and so it has potential. That's something we want to explore through this process. And then South Sanium, likewise. A lot of these Willamette Basin facilities have good supplies of cool, clean water, and that's kind of one of the main things we're going to need going forward. So those 3 were included in this look. To the webinar series, starting August 1, we've had this series of 3 webinars over the 3 weeks. The first one was really looking at the future need for hatchery programs, and it was taking a look at that need at the SMU basis, Species Management Unit, and those are really big kind of geographic units. So think the entire Oregon coast or the entire Rogue South coast, the lower Columbia and Willamette at that scale. And I think we'll get into some of the findings here soon. Then on August 8, we heard about the economic analysis, which is really looking at the what are the costs involved in running the state system, and then what benefits is it providing to Oregon. And again, we'll get into some of the details there soon. And then additionally on that, we looked at the impact of climate change on the vulnerability of some of these hatchery stocks. So we're rearing coho, spring chinook, fall chinook, steelhead, summer and winter. And we're rearing those in different parts of the state, so they're exposed to different conditions. And we're seeing already kind of differences in the performance of those stocks over time. And we're expecting those differences to continue and perhaps exacerbate. And so those folks at NOAA and OSU were looking at performance of different stocks in those different geographies over time, and then looking forward at how they might perform going forward. Then on the 15th, that was kind of a wrap-up webinar where we talked about a lot of the deferred maintenance needs at each facility, what the vulnerabilities were at each facility, and what upgrades might be necessary to deal with those vulnerabilities, so chilling and recirculation, et cetera. And then also how connected each facility is to the system as a whole. And then additionally, we ended talking about kind of the planning and policy context for this, which is important to keep in mind as we build this system for tomorrow. It's still rooted in that planning and policy context for how hatcheries are operating in concert with wild fish. And that's going to be there going forward too. So that was the webinar series. Okay. Yeah, just a comment on scale. We brought this up in the second webinar. Each of those analyses that was done by the contractors was at a different scale. Some of them were at the hatchery facility. For example, they were looking at what deferred maintenance needs to be done at a facility. Some of them were done at a statewide scale, like the economic benefit analysis. And some of them were done at an SMU scale, like the future need. And some even at the watershed scale, like the performance of those stocks. If we skip this one. Ultimately, we're going to have to make some decisions about where we invest at the watershed scale, but we're going to do that thinking about some of those costs, benefits, and other factors at the SMU and state scale. I guess I'm done. Thanks.
Yeah, for a second. I'm going to describe what we're about to do to go through the webinar results so everybody is on board. But before I do, does anybody have any questions for Sean about the portions he just presented? I think that's probably familiar information. Yes, we have a question in the room.
Consideration of going back to hatch boxes where there's no hatcheries involved, but we're just having volunteers take care of the updated new hatchery boxes that are available. Yes, they would be wild fish, but they would be hatchery fish, but they wouldn't be marked with the adequate fin flipper.
Let me restate the question just so people online can hear, and then I'll hand it over to Sean, and you might add to my understanding of this. But the question was there any consideration given to going back to hatch boxes? And I'm going to pause there and let Sean answer.
For this process, the department's not really considering that as an alternative. Our goal is to put a hatchery system in place that's sustainable. And the reason we've moved away from hatch boxes over time is that in terms of fishery performance, they just don't perform as well. We find that when you can get a fish up to smolt size and release it, their marine survival is a lot higher. And so you end up with better contribution to fisheries. And then over time also we learned that the limiting factor for a lot of our coastal populations was not the egg to fry survival stage, it was the kind of the juvenile stage over winter or over summer. And so you could put a lot more fry in there, but you're just not getting more smolts out because they're going through a bottleneck after that egg to fry stage. So that's kind of a long way of saying the department's not really considering that as part of this proposal, but that doesn't mean that the small groups can't discuss it as how it might augment potentially the hatchery system. But our goal really is to provide a system that can produce these smolts that have demonstrated success at meeting fishery needs and conservation needs. So hope that helps.
One more question in the room, and then we'll see if there are any online. Go ahead.
Well, you stated the reports are not available. So how are we going to do the process when we really don't have the full information?
The question in the room was, you said that the reports are not available, so how are we going to do the process if we don't have the information that we need?
Yeah, it's a good question, and obviously it's not our, not our first choice to have these reports not available now. But I do think you've got a sense through these webinars of what the main findings are, and those are really, with the exception of some of the economic stuff that I'll talk about in a minute, those are really not going to change. So the future need, you've kind of got a good sense of that for each. I guess we're going to go through these soon, but those takeaways are really not going to change between now and the final report coming out. So it's just going to add a layer of kind of context behind how they got to those decisions. And they should be coming out here in the next week or two. I think we're anticipating the 2 Four Peaks reports in the next week or so. The economics one's pretty soon after that, the Lincoln one pretty soon after that. So by the time we're into those September, October discussions, I think it'll be out there. And this is like a long process. Well, it's short, but it's also long enough that we can digest that information in the small groups and then come back in the big group as well and be kind of having that feedback along the way. Really, this timeline has been driven by the legislature. We've got to have a report back to them by January. And so we just don't have the time to stop and wait for things. And we're just kind of keeping to push the contractors as much as possible, but we also want a good product. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Well, I suggest you should consider that what we're doing now contingent upon actually receiving the final reports and information.
The follow-up comment in the room was asked for the department to consider the work that we do today as contingent upon receipt of the final reports. So we can work with that. Are there any questions online, Barton? And I can't see chat, so you'd have to let me know.
Yeah, no questions yet in chat, but if folks online would like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, and happy to take those from the audience at home.
Okay, it looks like nobody has a question right this second. Any other questions in the room before we dive in? One question, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that if we're assessing the hatcheries, that's kind of going backwards from, we need to assess the individual rivers with all the changes that are being made in our climate and the use of water by incursions of people building nearby on our access streams, that sort of thing. That's affecting the amount of water that we get into the hatcheries. I think those streams need to be assessed as well as the hatcheries.
The question or comment in the room was that it isn't sufficient to just assess hatcheries, that we would need to assess streams and stream health and water use and the effect of climate in addition to hatcheries. I'll let Sean respond.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks, Dennis, for the question. So you're right. We do need to assess the kind of health of those stream systems, and that was actually part of what Linker was doing. So the department's done a lot over the last few years to look at current and future stream flows and temperatures in those systems. And we've got quite a lot of sophisticated modeling online now where we can look at different land use practices and how that impacts temperatures and flows. And all of that information was given to Linker so that they could assess what the current kind of natural stream flows are in those systems and what they're going to be in the future. And that's what played into their vulnerability rankings. Additionally, each of our hatcheries, in some ways we're fortunate because they're typically higher up in the watersheds. They're oftentimes in forested areas and there's no consumptive uses above them. And because of that, we're really kind of at the mercy of natural stream flows. And that's where we're seeing some of the challenges. For example, like LC, there's no withdrawals above that system, but it's still struggling because the stream flows are decreasing over time. So we often have the senior water right in those systems. But again, we don't often have to call for that water because there is no one above us. So it's not so much a challenge of consumptive water users and competition with other users in the basin, with a couple of key exceptions. We're dealing with kind of challenges of nature and declining stream flows, and that information was incorporated into the assessment.
We have one more question in the room, and then maybe we can dive in and start to go webinar by webinar. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that
can appreciate the challenge that Oregon faces with funding. I mean, it's you know, if you look at corporate America and the way they're running facilities, it doesn't happen like this. There's a cost associated per square foot of a facility based on geography, based on public use, based on all that, and you know, it would be wonderful if we had that built into the funding mechanism of the way state agencies operate facilities. But one of the things that I'm hopeful that the outcome of this process is collective advocacy from folks in this room and the public that sees the value of hatcheries, that with clearly defined objectives. And I know that, you know, when we sit here and we measure the success of hatcheries today, we're really looking at, you know, we have a legacy effect here where we built these hatcheries, right? There wasn't a strategic plan that was developed that said, hey, here's what we want Oregon's hatcheries to look like. We just ended up down the road with 14 state-run hatcheries that, you know, may be completely irrelevant to as far as the organizational success of meeting the demands or meeting some measured objective of hatcheries. So I'm hopeful that, so I guess I worry a little bit about us measuring the success of the existing hatchery program just because it wasn't strategically developed and built. And I know you're thinking about this as well. We have talked about that. But I really want to emphasize that I think our objective here is really to define objectives of our hatchery program that are measurable, right? We have fisheries out there that we know that, for example, you know, the Lower Columbia fishery, our objective for that fishery is to have it open through the first week of September. And so those are, to me, those are relevant, really relevant parts of how we address the hatchery conversation here. And you know, I appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this. And those are some of the things I'm thinking about, or probably more of a statement than anything. But yeah, I just think we have to. I mean, infrastructure-wise, we could write a check and fix these things that are broken there. But how do those 14 hatcheries provide us with a measurable way to say we're successful? We're meeting the demands of both our science commitments, our conservation commitments, and also our commitment to the public.
I'm going to do my best to briefly restate that and also acknowledge for the folks online. I think if we can figure out, do these microphones work with that microphone? Okay, we will start using a microphone so you can hear the question directly rather than my restatement. I think that'll be a much better experience for you. My brief restatement, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is when the hatchery system was built, it wasn't done in a strategic manner necessarily. It was just sort of built. And so there's a little bit of nervousness about measuring the effectiveness of a hatchery system that wasn't built with a particular set of objectives in mind. And so the statement or the comment, the urging was that as we move forward, we develop a set of objectives for the hatcheries and we sort of make steps forward to meet those objectives. And the objectives were listed in sort of in all the categories: our science objectives, our conservation objectives, our fish objectives, and so I think that was kind of the take home: is let's start with objectives to guide our work. Is that fair?
It is, and I know you guys are thinking about this as well.
Yeah, Larry, I appreciate you bringing that up, and you're right. It is something we're thinking about, and when you look at it, for example, just from a strictly economics perspective and the vulnerabilities, you might say, for example, that LC doesn't make sense to invest in because it's coming out most vulnerable, pretty expensive to fix. But when you take that strategic look and say, like, how are we meeting all those needs across the coast, it might change that conclusion. And so I wouldn't draw any conclusions based on the information to date about just costs that it does or doesn't make sense to invest in a facility, because we've got to bring all those other factors that you mentioned in. And that is what we're looking to get out of this, is a system that's meeting the needs of kind of Oregonians and that we can actually sustain.
Thanks, Sean. So what we're going to do now is go webinar by webinar to revisit the key takeaways. And in the case of webinar 3, we actually have a more robust set of information, or at least a depiction of the information with some charts, and then we asked the department, and they did map the data that was found onto Oregon's hatchery map so that you can start to see what it looks like at the statewide scale. So we're going to go webinar by webinar, and we're going to pause after each one just to make sure that folks are clear on the takeaways, answer any questions about the takeaways, and sort of start a conversation about, is there anything surprising? Is this what you expected to see? What are the opportunities and challenges based on this information? So this is where we're really hoping for both the folks online and in the room to start to hear questions and ideas about what this data means to you and what you are sort of thinking about as you take it in. Does that make sense? Okay, let's see. We're going to let you do contractor updates real quick.
Yeah. So in terms of contract updates, I think we touched on this a little earlier. We're behind where we wanted to be with the contractors, which is really no fault of their own. This is a complex analysis a lot of them are doing, and it can take some time. And when we've received the drafts, we found some things that we needed to go back with them and correct factually. So we're anticipating that within this week we're going to have the 2 4 peaks reports. So again, one of those was on the future need for the system for hatchery product, and one of those was on the kind of policy planning context. We've seen both of the kind of finalized versions of those and think they're good to go. So just waiting on contractor to get those back to us in their final format. The economics assessment, so we presented that a couple of weeks ago, I think. And in that assessment, there was a couple of things that stood out to us. And again, we were getting these the day before we were presenting them to you, so not a lot of time to vet them. And one of the things in particular was kind of the value of trout in some of those facilities. It was really high. Like if you looked at Wizard, it was super high benefit. And also in visitation, very high numbers. So Chris and Scott looked through some of those data that went into that and some of the assumptions. And one of the errors that they had made was in assuming that the survival of all the trout being released was this 49%, which is typical kind of catchable survival. And in actual fact, a lot of those fish being released from Wizard and Elk River are fingerlings, so they have a lot lower survival. And so when you plot that out, it actually reduces the number of fish that are harvested and therefore reduces the benefit side of things. So that is going to change significantly. It's still a really big economic benefit to the state, but that number is going to come down. And there was a couple of other less large errors in that data set that are going to get fixed. And so we're meeting with those folks tomorrow, just going to go over the final touches on that, and then expect to have that here soon too. The Linker report, which was the big one, looking at the climate vulnerabilities, the deferred maintenance, and then some of the mitigation measures. They're sending us bits and pieces of that report as it's available, and we're again expecting that one to be probably in a couple of weeks ready for you all. So they're going to start coming in. They'll be posted on the website, and if you're signed up for those updates, you'll get a notice when they are posted, and you can dive in there and read it. So that's kind of where we are.
So this is just, oh, it went ahead one, hold on. This is the process I was describing. So just to sort of get the questions in your mind, as you are listening to the key takeaways from the webinars, sort of questioning, are these the outcomes you expected? Are they surprising in some way? And what do they mean to you? What are the opportunities or challenges that you see as a result of the data?
So this is webinar 1. We were looking at the future need for hatcheries, and there was 3 things that they looked at. This is 4 peaks again. One was kind of the mitigation side of things, and was there going to be any change in the expectation that mitigation was going to need to be provided? And that mitigation obligation is largely from the federal government in the Columbia Basin, the Willamette Basin, and the Rogue Basin. And it's based on the construction of those dams. And there's obviously discussion about Snake River dams at the moment, but that's probably a long ways out. And so for the foreseeable future, at least, we don't see any change in that need for the federal government to mitigate. Federal government might disagree with us, but we're going to continue operating under the assumption that those programs need to keep going forward. The other thing they looked at was kind of the harvest augmentation and conservation need side of things. And when you look at both of those things, they're really rooted in the health of wild fish. So you're looking at, on one end of the spectrum, the conservation program need. That's where you've got these really depleted wild populations and you're needing to supplement or even reintroduce in some cases. And so they looked at what that likelihood of future need was going to be, really just based on looking at that in terms of the current health of those wild populations, so the listing status, state and federal, and then some of the climate assessments that have been done, like by NOAA and ourselves, to say what's the trajectory for those populations likely going forward. And to a large extent, it's not going to be everywhere. There are still places where wild fish are likely to be resilient, but there's certainly, they found that there's going to be an increased need for conservation programs in some locations. And because they were looking at this at the SMU scale, again, that large scale, it's not to say that every stream in that SMU is going to need a conservation program, but certainly one or two might. And a good example, for example, on the Oregon Coast SMU, which runs from Columbia down to Elk River, we've started a conservation program in the Coquille. There's only one conservation program on the coast. Maybe in 10 years we'll have one more or two more. Maybe in 20 years, one or two more. But it's not going to be the whole coast. And then harvest augmentation. That's also tied to the health of wild populations in that these programs are really meant to meet the angler demand that's out there that wild fish cannot provide. For example, on the Oregon coast, wild fall Chinook constitute about 80% of the harvest out there, so they're currently meeting a lot of the demand need. But in future, if those wild fall Chinook populations decline, there might be increased need for fall Chinook production to meet that demand. Conversely, coho are really coming back strong, wild coho, and we're able to offer wild fish fisheries on coho. And if that trend continues, then potentially we could have more opportunity on coho just through wild fish fisheries. So they were looking at some of those kind of things and just answering the question, at this large scale, are we going to continue to need these three different kinds of hatchery programs? And the answer was yes in all cases, and potentially increasing in some. But again, it's not every basin in every SMU. It's going to be selective, and that's some of the things we'll talk about when we get into more detail on this. So I'll pause there, I think.
Yeah. So I think this is webinar 1. There are 3. So let's pause and see if folks have any questions, anything about this information that was surprising to them, if you got a chance to look at the webinar, or is it what you expected to hear? Any other thoughts? This is sort of a chance. And I also want to open up the possibility that if there is something that comes to mind that would be helpful to you to sort of work with this data, let us know that as well. Anybody online have any thoughts or questions? One sec. We'll start in the room, and we're actually going to use the microphone this time, hopefully. Did I miss somebody online, Barton? I saw a flash. No, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Again, Larry Phillips, American Sport Fishing Association. So I appreciate that, Sean. I think we think we support that approach moving forward. One of the things that concerns me is that we don't have clear definitions of what each of those programs are, right? Really clear. And in the absence of that, the conversations become emotional and folks get, there's, as you know, there's a lot of different opinions on all sides of this issue. So I would strongly encourage us to try to find a way to invest in that in terms of defining exactly what a conservation program is with the constraints. We know that we've supplemented opportunity fish populations in areas where we've got conservation concerns, and those are areas where people live typically. It's in areas where we have lost habitat, or the intrinsic productivity of those systems is much lower. Yet those are the areas that have some of the biggest conservation needs, and yet we also have some of the highest needs for supplementation because of sport fishing opportunities. So, thank you.
Could you hear that online, Barton? Okay, great. And it looks like there's a hand up online. Maybe just one. I can't see the name, unfortunately.
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question, Steve.
Okay, this is Steve Godin. I am online. I've considered going up there, but it's a long ways from where I live. But relative to the conservation opportunity questions that Larry was just raising, I'm concerned about the Umpqua River and Spring Chinook, and particularly the South Umpqua, where we've been struggling for years to keep a fishery open because of restraints or constraints on the South Umpqua. And this is more of a subspecies, if I can call it that, of Chinook salmon, but it's unique and in jeopardy, and I'm wondering why we don't take more of a conservation effort for that particular fishery. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to ask that question.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, you're referring to the South Umpqua population of the Umpqua kind of SMU there, which has been, historically running at around 100, 120 odd spring Chinook adults, but in the past few years, or 5 to 10 years, there's been years where it's been down as low as 20. So certainly some challenges with that population. We have been doing some work with OSU looking at the genetics of that and how distinct it is with the North Fork population, which should be rolling out soon. But yeah, these are the kinds of questions that come up with plan implementation, like the CMP. You have kind of your outline of what you're going to follow, and then you adjust to it as you kind of see what's going on with these populations. And making a decision to implement a conservation program is not one to take lightly. They're just very difficult to implement successfully. For example, Coquille, we made the call a couple of years ago with the Coquille tribe to implement a program down there. And getting your hands on wild brood in some of these systems is really challenging. I think the first year we managed to get 2 adult wild fish after a month of pretty intense effort on the stream. Last year we did a lot better, but still only enough to get about 50,000 eggs, actually a little higher. So these programs are difficult logistically to implement on some of these systems and also costly. And what we're talking about here is the department currently has to prioritize. Are you going to prioritize some of those conservation programs or the existing harvest programs? Because there's no new money that comes for any of those things. And so there's a lot of considerations that go into whether you want to start a conservation program, including can you run it successfully? Will it have the desired effect? And what else is that going to do to your hatchery portfolio? And I think it's certainly something that's worthy of discussion here.
Chris, there was a related question online in the chat, or Sean, sorry. Does or will the department have criteria for when a conservation hatchery needs to be established?
No, that's not something we have in policy currently, but I think as we enter this new kind of realm where we expect to see potentially more need for it, that is something that will need to be addressed going forward. When we put in place the Coquille program, we started to define some kind of metrics for how you might go about that in terms of what the quasi-extinction threshold was for the population and what level of spawners you would need to see for multiple years, but it really hasn't been translated into a policy yet. And again, that's probably not something this group is going to get into, but more thinking about, well, do we see that need going forward, and what might a hatchery system look like, and how would you prioritize that over harvest programs and other things? I think these are all things the groups can wrestle with and give input to the department on that could inform future policy, for example.
We have a question in the room. Can you use them? Yep. Thank you.
And that is, I thought the demographic data in very weak. I think it's no secret, and you can find support for this in the department's budget documents, that most sports fishermen are in older cohorts, and the younger cohorts coming up don't have much participation. This may mean that there's less need for fish to catch by sport fishermen in the future.
Thanks for the comment. Do you have any feedback?
Just over that. I think you're referring to demographic data from the harvest side of things, right?
From the what?
Harvest side of things, not the fish population side.
Yes.
So the
I'm talking just angler population.
yeah. So one of the things Four Peaks analyzed was what were the trends in license sales and tag sales and those kind of things, and they found that license sales had been relatively steady the last, was it decade or so, Chris? Yeah. But tag sales, on the other hand, have been going down, and tag sales are associated with salmon steelhead harvest, obviously. They couldn't make any conclusions on that because there's a couple of hypotheses, one being that people are just transitioning to other fisheries, like trout or warm water, or it could be they're just not happy with the opportunity, and so they're choosing not to fish on salmon steelhead. But it just pointed out this possibility that there could be societal shifts, or that could be that people are not happy with the product and so choosing other things. We don't necessarily know which it is, but it's something that we can all think about in the future demand for that system. And then we do have kind of license sales broken down by age groups, I think, and we can look at that. Certainly something we can bring to the table. I don't think it points to quite the picture you're painting that we're going to lose all these people going forward. There is quite a healthy kind of younger cohort coming through in those license sales, but again, are they fishing for trout or are they fishing for salmon steelhead? I don't know. We have that information yet.
Are there any other questions online, Barton?
We do have another question online. This one's from Adam Bronstein. Are there examples in Oregon of successful anadromous conservation hatchery programs where stocking was ceased and wild fish thrived afterward? And why is, in quotes, meeting angler demand, end quote, the main metric for success and not wildness?
Thanks, Adam, for the question. Yeah, so I think the Umatilla program, Umatilla Spring Chinook, you could point to that as being successful in, we didn't have spring Chinook, they were extirpated above 3 Mile Dam there, and through the efforts of the state and tribe there, we now have a pretty decent population of spring Chinook above there. Lower Columbia chum, we haven't quite got there yet, but that is a conservation program that is ongoing, and it's really the only thing sustaining chum in the Lower Columbia. Willamette River above the dams, we're not there yet, but hatchery fish are the source for a lot of those reintroductions above the high head dams, and it's going to take both that reintroduction effort and also fish passage improvements from the Corps to be able to see that play out. In most cases, we're looking at really long-term habitat efforts to recover the habitat to the place where those supplementation efforts can be successful, and we're just kind of buying time in a lot of cases, like in the Upper Columbia, kind of Snake and Upper Columbia areas. Those habitat efforts are just ongoing, and we're going to need them to continue, and until we get there, we're going to need to continue some of that supplementation. But there have been places where it's been successful, both here and in Washington. And to your other point about anglers, I think it was angler satisfaction? That's just one of the metrics that we're looking at here. Obviously, we're looking to meet, to the extent possible, the demand out there and provide a product that anglers are enjoying and engaging in for 2 reasons. One being that that's part of our mission is utilization, and 2 being that when we have engaged people in supporting salmon steelhead, you have a cohort of people that are engaged in habitat restoration, for example, and the surcharge on every angling license, $2, or was it a little less than $2, that goes to screening and passage, for example. We've been able to use that to open up thousands of miles of habitat and screen a lot of diversions out there, which again you don't have if anglers are not interested in purchasing some of these products. But it's only one metric that we're looking at. We are looking at the health of wild populations, and we are running those hatchery programs to be consistent with sustainable wild populations. That's what our coastal multi-species plan is about. That's what our Rogue South Coast plan is about. That's what all these ESA recovery plans are about. And so it's just one of the things we're looking at here and trying to manage the whole system for both hatchery and wild fish.
Anything else online or follow up to that question?
Well, my question was where these conservation programs have ceased, not where they're ongoing. Like, do we have evidence that they actually work? Of course, if there's no fish in a system and you add hatchery fish, you know, there's going to be fish there now, but have we actually weaned the hatchery stocking off and then had a successful result? Self-sustaining.
I guess I might have to phone a friend on this one. Like, I think the Umatilla, are we still supplementing that? We are? Yeah. So I'm not sure. Are there any, Chris, that you're aware of?
I would point to the upper Clackamas, the spring chinook. We still maintain a harvest down below Riverville Dam, but we provided passage so the wild fish could hit spawning areas, rearing areas.
This doesn't fill me with much confidence. Just I wanted to make that point. You know, if we're looking long-term, trying to sustain these populations, I've just, if we don't have the data to point to, I'm not very confident right now in this.
Yeah, this is Scott Patterson with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. The best example we have to date is the upper Clackamas River with spring chinook. We put in passage, or PGE put in passage, so those wild fish could access spawning grounds, rearing habitat up above that series of dams, and they are now returning thousands, if not tens of thousands, of wild spring chinook annually. And we're able to maintain a harvest program below the dam just because the dam is the barrier and we can collect fish there. But we are no longer supplementing any of spring chinook in the Clackamas River, and it's been replaced with wild fish.
And Adam, I think the point you should take home here is that in a lot of places where we are faced with these depleted wild populations, it's because largely of the habitat, and those habitat limiters haven't yet been addressed. And so there's an ongoing need for the supplementation for those populations to be successful. Clackamas is likely an outlier because there's been a lot of work going on in that upper basin, and we've seen a real turnaround in steelhead, coho, and spring chinook in that basin. And in the lower Columbia, it's really kind of one of the shining stars along with Sandy. But in other locations, we're still seeing those limiting factors play out and ongoing need. And this kind of process isn't really about whether that approach is right or wrong. It's more about, is that something that needs to be built into the capacity of the hatchery system going forward? And that's something that is, you know, we fully expect the groups to kind of weigh in on. Is that something they want to see us building into the capacity of the system going forward? And what does that look like?
We do have two other questions online.
Great.
Perfect. Leonard, would you like to go first? And then Steve, I've got you on deck afterward.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'd just like to bounce off a couple of those latest comments and say that in addition, which most of us in the room believe that hatchery production is a conservation measure and helps protect our wild fish, but about the harvest portion of it, you know, recreational fishing is the gateway to conservation for fish. Without that, our fish runs would be in a lot more trouble, and that's easy to see with other species, you know, like birds. Most of America's birds have been declining over the decades and centuries, and ducks are a win-win story because of hunting and all the conservation funding and efforts that have gone towards it. And fishing is no different. In addition to that, people like to fish for food. It's important to our who are marginalized, underprivileged, and underserved communities especially, if they can go out and affordably buy a license and tag and help with their food scarcities, that's huge. And that's not just Oregon, but that's nationwide. Thank you.
Thank
you, Leonard. Teresa, any other comments on that in the room, or should we move on to Steve's question?
I don't see any comments on that. You can go ahead with Steve.
All right, Steve.
Okay, I'm just going to weigh in support of what's being said. That, you know, if you look at populations that have been started with hatchery programs, you don't have to look any further than Odell Lake and see a sustainable population, a very sustainable population of kokanee. So that's one example. It's right within our state. If you want to go out of state and go back to New York, where I came from years ago, and go to Lake Ontario and sustainable populations of coho, Chinook salmon, steelhead, brown trout, lake trout, all sustainable in Lake Ontario. And the coho and Chinook and perhaps the steelhead, the original eggs for those programs came from Oregon and Washington. So it's quite easily understood, at least on my part, that these programs can lead to sustainable populations. So I just wanted to weigh in and support what's being said. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Anybody in the room have any questions or comments? Any synthesizers in the room that are starting to think of paths forward based on the different perspectives we're hearing? Anybody online? We can move on to webinar 2. I just want to make sure we've heard everything on webinar 1. Oh, I see Leonard. Do you have another comment?
I just wanted to say I'm excited about, bounce off Larry Phillips' comment. I'm excited to see this turn into a more strategic plan about where and how to facilitate our hatchery production. It's been put together a little haphazardly over too many decades. This is a great opportunity to shore things up. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go to webinar 2 and see what questions come up.
So this webinar was all about the economics of the system in terms of the costs it's taking to run it, the benefits it's producing to the state. And a couple of takeaways from this was that it showed that there really was a significant economic benefit to the state. The number in the webinar was around 79 million. Again, that is going to come down because of the issue with the trout production and the way they calculated that. But regardless, it's still going to be a pretty significant economic benefit to the state. And that's on a state investment of around 6 million in those 14 hatcheries. The trout stocking programs, regardless of the corrections that are going to be made, they still generate most of the economic benefit there relative to salmon steelhead. And a large part that's due to the survival of those fish. The winter steelhead programs have the highest benefit, net benefit, and the summer steelhead programs are producing a negative net benefit. And a lot of that is due to recent kind of poor performance of those programs, low survival in the marine area, but also the costs involved there. And then the smaller coastal facilities, it's not too surprising, but they have a lower net benefit. And that's largely because they're small, but they still require 3 staff to run them. That's kind of the minimum we need at a facility. And a lot of those costs are tied up in the personnel. That said, even though they produce less net benefit, they are located in coastal areas, and those fisheries are a significant contributor to the local economy. So you don't just want to look at the net benefit on its own. You have to look at the context it's embedded in. And that was part of the third webinar that they looked at.
So we'll pause again and hear Any questions or reactions to these key takeaways, the economic takeaways? Any surprises? Is this what you expected to hear? We'll start in the room. Let me give you the microphone. Hold on one sec. Thanks, Linda.
I apologize if this came up at any of the earlier group meetings. But on the economic side, it's important to me personally that somehow you all track volunteerism by hatchery. Our Hatchery Wild's economic impact study for hatchery shows that by hatchery. I think there's an economic factor in there. I don't know how it works, but there's certainly value to it, not only offsetting costs at the hatcheries. You know, when a group goes down and puts a weir in at Cedar Creek, there's value in that because it took 12 people rather than the 2 hatchery people there. So it would be great if that could be recorded in this. I don't know if it's part of your agreement to do that, but certainly from the aspect of those volunteers that give so much in this state, that's a big number and it's really important. And I know the department has done some studies, but we have one from 2022 that's pretty good.
Was everybody able to hear that online? Okay. Did you want to respond?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Don, for that comment, and maybe we should just catch up after. And I think part of what you're talking about there would get reflected in reduced costs of actually running the programs because you're relying on volunteers.
Exactly.
Yeah, but let's catch up.
We can go online. I see a question. Is that Steve? Yeah.
Yeah, it's Steve. It's me again. I just
Hello.
wanted to weigh in on. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I know the step hatcheries aren't included in this analysis, but when you get down to your 4th bullet about small coastal facilities, the step hatcheries, all volunteer effort, are contributing, I think, quite a bit to the ocean fishing and the bay fishing, the terminal hatcheries that I think benefit the coastal community so much, as well as even some commercial fishing that goes on. So I wish that somehow the step hatcheries were more of a consideration in what we're talking about. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I know that the step hatcheries are a topic we're discussing as we design the process and thinking about. Leonard?
Yes, I agree with Steve. At one time, the salmon production was, I don't have the data, but I have some of the history, much higher than it is now. And it contributed quite a bit to our commercial fisheries out there, and especially salmon. And if you look at the coast, our salmon commercial fisheries are just about gone. And there's no doubt if we want to feed the state, the country, the world, feed them fish, we're going to have to go to aquaculture. This is a very small, very minuscule piece of the pie. But looking forward, that's where we're going to have to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, in the room, let's get you the mic. There you go.
So do you have numbers that of the total expenses that the hatcheries to run them as opposed to the benefit analysis based on the outputs, the economic benefits? So basically totals, if you've got that, that'd be great.
Yeah, one of the components in that webinar, which you can get the PowerPoint online, PDF of the PowerPoint online, that has the costs broken down by each hatchery in terms of buckets of like personnel and supplies versus management activities versus deferred maintenance, depreciation. So that information's all in graphical format in the PDF online, but it'll be in much more detail in the report that comes out too.
So do you have an estimate of what the overall costs are? An estimate of the overall costs as opposed to the economic benefit that's received? I mean, have they come up with a total?
Yeah, total cost to run the 14 state hatcheries. Do you mean a total cost to run the 14 state hatcheries? Yeah, Scott could probably give you the accurate number. Was it somewhere around 18 million? Scott?
I'm going to be honest with you, I don't have that off the top of my head, but
I think it's around 18. We've got 6 general fund and about 13 license, right?
that's true, but then some of them are biennial budgets and some of them are annual budgets.
Yeah.
And so I would think we're more in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 annually.
Annually, yeah.
That's operational costs, that's some deferred maintenance, that's marking, tagging, fish health, administration, HMPs, everything else that comes under that umbrella of administrative staff and operations.
And in relationship to the estimated economic benefit as a whole?
Yeah, so those costs were part of the cost benefit analysis. So when you're talking about net benefit, it's cost benefit minus those costs, total benefit minus those costs. So the 79 we quoted in the second webinar, without, let's just assume Scott's right and it's around a $10 million annual, the actual benefit from the total benefit from the system is closer to 89, and then you subtract those 10 million costs to get the 79. Again, that total benefit's going to come down, but that's how they calculated the net benefit, was using those costs and then looking at the total benefit and subtracting.
Let's go online and then we'll come back in the room. I just want to make sure folks followed that conversation, and if you're interested, do download the presentation off of the department's website, because it was just a conversation about what the total costs were and then what the total benefit was of the system and how they came to the number that they did. Is there a question? I see somebody has a hand up.
Go for it, Brian.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Hey, I apologize. I've had to come in and out of this presentation, so if I'm off base, just let me know. I have a question regarding your, I guess, economics part of it, the economic benefits. There's been some changes recently to, I know, the North Fork Nehalem program for coho, also the Trask program for coho, to switch broodstocks to a later timed a native origin broodstock, I believe. There's also been some changes with respect to the steelhead program on the North Fork Nehalem to make part of that broodstock using native origin fish. And I was wondering how your analysis, if it could incorporate in its analysis any of those changes at this point, because I think those changes were designed to improve the hatchery program, not only the recruit of fish back, but possibly also the return on investment, so anglers could catch more of those fish. And I'm wondering if your economic analysis could capture any of that, because those have been recent changes to those programs. And then my second question is sort of related to that, in that, especially for like the North Fork Nehalem, my experience is there's a really lack of access. Both bank access and boat access is very limited, because there's a number of cascades that boats have to go over. It limits the amount of people that can access that river, and therefore maybe reduces the return on investment, because people aren't able to catch as many fish and have as many fishing days on that river. And how will your analysis kind of look at that and say, well, maybe the return on investment is X now on that system, but if we were able to provide more access somehow, we think we could significantly increase the number of anglers that could access these fish that are returning to that facility. And how is that going to be kind of incorporated in this analysis?
Thanks, Brian. You challenged me by asking two long questions there, but I'll try and remember them. To your first one about whether some of the recent changes in, let's just say not just Nehalem, but other programs too, how they were reflected in this benefit analysis. And Chris can shake his head if I'm wrong, but I don't think they really were. What they did was chose a time period that reflected a kind of a period of returns, say from like 2010 through 2020, where you had some good ocean years, some poor ocean years. So you want to look like what an average kind of harvest rate for those programs is. You don't want to focus all your benefit analysis on periods where the ocean conditions are really good, and likewise you don't want to do it when they're really bad, because that'll bias it. So they chose a fairly long period, like a decade, was it, Chris? He nodded. To calculate those benefits. And so when you're talking about changes that may have been initiated in the last couple of years, and we're still, in some cases, waiting for those fish to come back, that wouldn't be captured. If it was in the last part of that period that they did use, it would just be kind of moderated out by those other years in that analysis. And so you can make some assumptions as an individual about what those benefits might do one way or the other based on changes in the program. But that's not part of what they did at that fine scale. And then to your second question about whether they're going to look at scenarios, for example, of what if access improved, would the benefit go up? That again isn't something they did. They were just looking at hard and fast, what are the costs to run the current system, and then what are benefits accruing it from the way it's being operated currently. And those benefits were derived from the harvest rates at current times. So again, as an individual, you could make some assumptions about if we increased access and got more anglers on there and more fish being caught, benefits going to go up. You could likewise make some assumptions that ocean conditions are going to become more poor and less fish coming back, and so less harvest, and benefits going to go down. These are things that as individuals we could do, but not, that wasn't part of the scope of this assessment, because there's just so many scenarios that you could run for each basin. It wasn't practical in the time. But I think they're good questions to ask and think about as we take this strategic look at the system. Like, we're going to be focused on the system itself, but there are other things that could be brought into discussion about, hey, if you could do this thing, it would make this function a lot better. And that's certainly things we can think about and try and incorporate.
Do we have a question in the room? Yep.
I just want to make a comment real quick. Sorry, I don't have a question. I'm pretty bummed to look up there and see, the summer steelhead program, have a negative. Specifically speaking for the Rogue and the Umpqua, those summer steelhead are very unique. I think as an angler, if you look, there's not a fish in, an anadromous fish in that river that's longer, that you're able to go after more than the summer steelhead. Those summer steelhead in the Rogue River and the Umpqua, they'll start coming in and being, they're harvestable in April. And, there's people taking those fish home in November that are still edible. So it just stinks to see, here's this great fish that has this long-term window in fresh water, for anglers to go after, and it's the cost effect is negative. Just want to bring that up.
Thanks, Colby. Yeah, it is one of the things that has stuck out in a couple of places. The negative cost benefit is just one aspect of it. And again, like I mentioned, for each hatchery facility, that doesn't necessarily mean anything in and of itself, because there are other factors, like you pointed out. Like in the Willamette, that summer steelhead fishery is really popular because it's in a time of year when you can get out and enjoy yourself on the river rather than being subject to driving rain and other things. But in terms of economics, it is a net negative benefit to the state. And then the other thing was the kind of viability assessment, which is part of that webinar as well. And the summer steelhead programs are just proving challenging, partly because of freshwater conditions. They're coming in hot temperatures, partly because of the ocean too. We've seen collapses in both hatchery and wild fish for summer steelhead recently. So there's some real challenges for the summer steelhead, both wild and hatchery going forward.
We have another question in the chat, Teresa.
Okay, go ahead.
Kirk Blaine asked, how is depreciation being factored into the consideration of facilities?
Yeah, so this is still something we're trying to wrap our heads around, because there's the way economists account for depreciation, there's the way the state deals with depreciation, and I think some in the room here have pointed out, these facilities were built in 1920s, 1950s, 70s, and so largely they've fully depreciated, yet economically you still have to account for that, and that is something the economists did for each facility. They calculated an annual depreciation, and that's included in the costs. But really, the way the state is thinking about it is that when you look at webinar 3 and what the total investment needed at each facility is, that's kind of the depreciation cost built in. Like, that's what it's going to cost to get those facilities back working, and that's the cost that we're going to see in our kind of biennial budget, and legislature will see. So we're still thinking about how to operate that, but it is in the economic assessment. And then, like I said, there is the piece for us of what's it going to cost to get this system to where it needs to be.
Thank you, Sean. You answered my question.
One back there first. We have a couple questions in the room.
Yeah, this is Jennifer with Native Fish Society. So, I think the economic analysis, there's a lot of great information in there. At the same time, we're going to have to be really aware of what it does and doesn't do for us. And so, I think it sounds like it's going to be very focused on hatchery production, particularly hatchery harvest is kind of the base metric. But it sounds like there wasn't a lot of externalities included in the cost-benefit analysis. So, what are some of the externalized costs of operating this system on water quality, energy use, wild fish? So I think we have to just be clear that it does have a specific focus and a specific purpose. Along with that, as we get into kind of talking about what the future looks like, we kind of have to think in opportunity costs as well. So as we're talking about, okay, if we are looking at a potential system that's going to cost, I'm just going to throw out a random number, $200 million. Well, what's the opportunity costs of putting that money into the system versus barrier removal and habitat restoration? So I think these are some of the kind of like bigger things we will have to wrestle with, and to keep in mind, what the benefits of this analysis are and what the limitations of the analysis are.
Thank you. And in case we haven't said it, we are recording all of the questions and comments so that we can use them in the process. So this is all very helpful. Go ahead. Wait 1 sec. Can we get you the microphone? Yeah.
In considerations in this, to your point, where you show that it's not cost effective, how much do you spend to go there to go fishing for a couple of days?
I live really close to those rivers.
I know what I spend to fish the Rogue, so.
Seeing, I guess just to elaborate or to add more, seeing just local folks spending money at the stores, fishing in these areas, where these fish are at for a long period of time, there's a lot,
sure,
right? There's a significant amount.
So I think the department has.
Hold on 1 sec. I'm going to have you pause because people online can't hear the back and forth between you two. So there's just a conversation going on about sort of when people go fishing, the amount of money that they're spending in the stores, the money they're spending to get there, the money they're spending locally to sort of engage in the activity.
So clearly in this analysis, the department has to look at the cost to the department, not in a holistic way in terms of investment in the communities and people like my friend over here or me that drive somewhere, the cost of doing that and what it goes back into the state. Is there any kind of a factor for that? Because when I look at, I'll do an egregious thing. This is Hatchery Wild's couple of years out, but it's the economic impacts of hatcheries. And this is the net economic value of hatcheries and hatchery fish in Oregon. And just the value to recreational anglers is 228 million. So these are good numbers, and I think we all understand that you have to look at it as a cost to the department, but is there a way to look at it in terms of the value to the state? For me to go to the Rogue, it's going to be $500 for a weekend, plus the boat, plus the truck, plus the...
Yeah, Don, and when we are looking at it in cost to the state, it really is just the cost side of that equation. But when the economists did the analysis, they were looking at the benefit to the state, and that's that, 79 to come down $1 million number. The net benefit, taking out those costs of the department, was pretty high to the state. So they were, all the things that Colby was talking about, you were talking about, they're in their assessment. And the reason why it's smaller than, say, the number you've got is because we're just looking at those 14 facilities. You think of all the benefit generated on the Columbia, the Willamette, also from wildfish fisheries and from marine fisheries. None of that is in there. This is just the 14 hatchery facilities. So it's really focused on that, and it does include benefit to the state and all those small businesses, et cetera. So.
Any more questions on cost-benefit analysis or economics before we move to webinar 3?
We have 2 more questions online from the chat, Teresa.
Okay.
Heath asked, does the cost analysis break out hatchery costs related to defending litigation and receiving federal ESA approvals versus hard operational costs like food and staff time?
To some extent, it does. So it's capturing costs associated with some of the management, which is certain headquarters staff, for example, and some of their time is spent on litigation. And so to some extent, it's capturing that. It's not capturing everyone, like myself, for example. And what was the second part to that question? Sorry.
The other specific thing mentioned, including to defending litigation and then receiving federal ESA approvals versus those operational costs.
Yeah, so it does include those costs because, again, that's largely headquarters staff in Scott's program, which are accounted for, but then also, the kind of regional staff that play a role in those HGMP developments and planning processes. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sean. And then Liz's question was, how is CPUE factored into economic benefit determination, if at all?
I'm pretty sure Liz is talking about catch per unit effort. And I don't know that that's the approach they took to this. They were looking at our either ELS, so electronic licensing system.
Sean, I might.
Sure. Chris is gonna.
I might be able to help with this a little bit. So CPUE does figure into the analysis in the sense that there's a link between getting to the number of fish that are harvested has to then be translated into a number of angler days. And so that's how you get from, economists have to make assumptions about how many angler days are spent catching those fish that we see in the total catch. And then there's they also used then, getting back to the previous comments about there's a amount of money that, or economic impact that's associated with each of those angler days or angler trips that then is used to calculate that economic benefit, or the economic impact, I should say.
Thanks, Chris. It's always good to have an expert in the room.
Any other questions on economics or thoughts?
One over here.
Oh, right here. Okay.
I think Ashley was up.
Oh, another one? We have 2 in the room. 1 sec.
I have a really simple one. I remember in that analysis, there was talk of the economic benefit that comes to hatcheries when people visit and spend money at neighboring things, right? And then there was a comment that that they might not be going to the hatchery specifically, or like traveling specifically to go to the hatchery.
Was the analysis adjusted based on that comment? I was wondering if there was any, and also like, is this, what proportion of that total benefit was this other kind of external visitation benefit? Yeah, do you know what percentage of it? Is this like a pretty small potatoes part of it?
In the assessment that we shared in the webinar weeks ago, it was visitation, the benefit generated from visitation was similar in magnitude to that from operations and from anadromy. Smaller than anadromy, but not by much. That number is being revised down, and I'm not sure what contributed to that decision, but they took another look at some of their assumptions around visitation and decided that they had kind of overestimated the contribution from that, and so that is part of what's being revised down.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks for taking that into consideration. I thought that was a thoughtful comment, so appreciate it.
And then I think Larry.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm reading that third bullet, and I'm struggling a little bit to understand the bottom part is the summer steelhead programs are not cost effective. So, you know, and I'm guessing it's the number of people who went on trips per day, and you compare that with the cost associated with rearing, collecting, and aquaculture for the hatchery program. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and I describe it as they're just having a negative net benefit. So the cost to produce those fish is higher than the benefits generated to the state from their harvest. And most of that is related to the survival of those stocks recently. They're not harvested at a high rate.
Okay, so you're not returning at a high rate, or they're not harvested at a high rate?
It's probably a combination of both, depending on the system you're in.
Yeah, I mean, okay. Yeah, I'll dig into the math here and better understand it. I think that one of the challenges, obviously, with summer steelhead, when they come back, there's extra costs associated with holding fish. There's rearing different times, temperatures. I'm guessing you're using chillers in certain places. And
actually, we're not currently, but I think that's one thing we're looking at. Yeah.
Problem.
But just to give an example where I am actually familiar, the Umpqua, because Chris and I were talking about it. You know, the data that went into that, it was like an 80,000 average release, smolt release, and a harvest on that is about 600 fish annually, so it's not super high. So when you've got the costs associated with that production, but a very minimal harvest, you're not generating a lot of benefits. And Chris, I don't know if you want to add any more detail to that, given you know a lot more about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think this is where it's going to be really helpful for folks to look through the economist report when they come out of it. There's a lot of things about economic analysis that for lay folks like us who don't operate in those worlds that are kind of may not be intuitive, and so there's two kind of approaches they take to economic benefit analysis and the cost benefit analysis. One of them is this regional economic impact approach that looks at how the money flows out into the local economies and goes through these economic multipliers and turns into an economic benefit at the regional level. There's also a way that you can look at benefit that is more from a angler willingness to pay, kind of what the economic benefit to a person who goes out fishing is, and that's where we saw the summer steelhead programs having this, you know, the net economic benefit is negative because the amount of kind of benefit that flows from fish being harvested and people having a successful day fishing for summer steelhead was less than the kind of the operational cost and everything associated with producing fish. And that really does come down to those survival rates and how many fish are out there to be harvested relative to a fish that's relatively expensive to raise because you have to raise it to a yearling stage before release. And you have to release a lot of fish to get a relatively small number of fish back. So when we do get to that economic analysis, it's going to be really important to go into it and really read those. And we're hoping that, and I think the economists know that they need to provide some really clear explanations for these two different concepts that are going to be in that report.
I see a hand up online.
Go for it, Brian.
Thanks. I think some of my question was just addressed with respect to making the distinction between economic benefits and economic impacts. And I do think when we see the full report, to make an explanation about how some of the impacts can be distributed across the landscape differently. And I think some of these coastal hatcheries provide a significant impact that turns into economic benefits to rural areas and amounts to a transfer of wealth really from urban areas to rural areas, because people like me travel from Portland and urban areas to go out and fish from urban areas to rural areas and spend our money out there fishing, and that's an important thing to capture. And the other thing I would ask is if the economic benefit analysis incorporated non-consumptive benefits, such as just existence value. And I know those are incorporated a lot in values of environmental values, but I think there's also something to be said for hatchery values, because just on a personal level, my value of a hatchery system is not just in the day I get to go fishing. I'm pretty much a weekend warrior. I have a lot of other commitments and I don't get to go as much as I would like, but I love the seasons being open so I can go when I can and when the weather is good and stuff like that. And so maybe I only get out there one day, but having an open season, which generally our hatchery is one of the things that provide those open seasons, allows me to be able to take advantage of days that I do have to go. And so just having a hatchery system working and therefore open seasons allows me to have this existence value, I would say, that's maybe not captured in just the day that I get to go fishing. And so I'm concerned that might be all that's captured in the economic benefits analysis. And I think an economic benefit should actually be broader than that. And I'm not sure if that's captured in it or not.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to let Chris kind of give you some insight in some of the discussions that went around that here in a sec. But to put it kind of in plain terms, those kind of non-market values were not included in the assessment. And it's some of the things that Jennifer was referring to earlier. There's a whole range of non-market values that you could incorporate, but there was some pretty good reasons, we think, why they weren't part of this analysis. And Chris, do you want to give a bit more detail about some of those?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the good question, and it's something we thought about a lot, and we've talked to the economists about, and it will be part of their final report, explaining some of these non-market benefits, and so I think the challenge from the economist perspective is that they have to try to use real data to inform their analyses. And so the one piece of data that they have that they can look at is, this comes from surveys of anglers and kind of understanding what the value to them is of a day of fishing and of harvesting a fish. And so they have information they can draw from other studies to inform that. When you get into these other kind of values, it has to be driven by survey data that, of course, in the time frame of this study, we don't have time to collect that information. And it can be very difficult to apply studies from other places because of just the unique characteristics of the particular river or hatchery system you're looking at. And then also, when you start to try to incorporate those, you start to come into these difficulties of putting things on an equal footing. So you can think about from the perspective of the existence values for some folks, and then also from if you're looking at a tribal perspective of maintaining your culture and having fish to harvest. These things are very difficult to put on even footing with other kinds of economic valuations that we typically do. And so the economists are going to address these by noting the range of things that aren't in their analysis and really making it clear what was in the analysis and what is addressed by their benefit analysis. So I think that's going to come through really clearly in the report, and they'll explain why those things can't be incorporated, but also they shouldn't be minimized and they should be part of your thinking about the system.
Thanks, Chris. I see 2 hands up. I also want to do a quick time check because we're getting really close to lunch, so I don't think that we'll charge into webinar 3. I think we'll take a break and let people eat lunch. So let's answer these 2 questions and then we'll take a break. Does that sound good to folks online? I'm getting a thumbs up from Barton. Hopefully it does. And maybe we only have
Brian,
one. Yeah.
did you have a follow-up, or if your hand is still raised, if you could lower it, then I'll just jump straight into Dave. All right, Dave, you're up, and then lunch.
Oh, goody. I'm up before lunch. My name is Dave Keene. I'm the president of the Oregon South Coast Fishermen, based here in Brookings, Oregon. We have about 230 members in our group, and we are a STEP organization. I'm coming in late to this program. I missed the first 3 webinars, and I do see now I have a lot more data to digest to get up to speed. But I just wanted to comment on our little bubble area here of the Chetco River. Our hatchery program is a huge benefit to our economy, our local economy here. We do assist ODFW in collecting Chinook broodstock from the Chetco River and then getting them to the Elk River hatchery, where then we put the smolt back into the system here on the Chetco. But as far as our winter steelhead program, we're entirely an angler caught program. We get together and we catch the winter steelhead. We have permission to hold them in tanks and pens, and then they're collected by ODFW. We help transport them to the Elk River hatchery. We just initiated a live spawn, so they then, after spawning, they are returned back to the Chetco system, and eventually the smolt are put in. But it's a lot of work, a lot of man hours go in, and we help. We save them quite a bit of money, I believe, with all the volunteers that we have doing this. So, but I just want to comment, we have people coming over from the valley. You talked about the economic benefit. People they come here and spend their days in the hotels and then the eateries. It's a huge economic boost to our area having a hatchery program. And just finally to comment on what I think Teresa mentioned earlier, I'm just now learning a little bit about the small group you're talking about. And I like what she said about keeping the open lines of communication between the large group that we're doing today and the small groups. So I'll be anxiously following what's to come down the road. And I want to thank you all for putting this together. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate those comments.
That was a nice way to take us into lunch, Dave. I appreciate that. Why don't it is, what time is it? About 12:02. I am tempted to say that we don't need a full hour for lunch, but I don't want to say that if folks need to get in their car and drive somewhere in the room. Does anybody need the full hour in the room? Feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I think I'm going to go with 30 minutes if that works for people online and in the room. And we can go ahead and get back to work because we have a little bit more to do on the webinars. If you have a problem with that, will you just drop a chat real quick and say that doesn't work? If we get a bunch, we'll readjust. So we'll pause for a second. Anybody in the room? Is that going to be an issue? Okay. Barton, are you seeing any trouble there?
No trouble listed in the chat.
Okay, great. So we will see everybody back here at 12:30. Please enjoy your lunch. Please get outside if you can. Stretch your legs. We'll talk to you soon.